All right, hello, this is Larry Loh, Music Director of Symphoria. I'm very pleased to have our soloist for the Beethoven Third Piano Concerto. Please welcome Stephen Heymand. Steve, welcome.
Thank you, Larry. It's great to be here.
Steve, it is so great to have you on this program. I know that you are very familiar. I mean, the audience that is about to see you, our Syracuse audience, is very familiar with your work, and you have a long association with the orchestra. I do want to ask you a little bit about this concerto. It happens to be one of my favorite of the Beethoven 5 piano concertos. The minor key, the way it starts with the piano, the second movement so eloquent and poetic.
Unbelievable.
Last movement so playful. Can you tell us a little bit about your history with this? I assume this is not the first time you've played it.
No, I was fortunate that as a student back in the early 80s, which is a long time ago now, I was fortunate enough to win a national piano competition out in Ohio, where the prize was to play this Beethoven Third Concerto with their orchestra on a subscription concert. So the first time I played this piece was in the early 1980s, and I played it probably 6 or 7 times in the interim between then and now. Most recently, a few years ago, under the baton of Leon Fleischer, which was really a treat, a thrill, and a scary experience for me.
Well, tell us a little bit about that, because I mean, I've seen him live I had seen him live many times during his career after he came back from his long time playing with just his left hand. Hadn't seen him as much as a conductor, but I assume that as a pianist, he must be intimidating for soloists who are pianists. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, I have to say, growing up, his recordings of the 5 Beethoven concertos with Zell in Cleveland were just monumental and legendary. And he was always a favorite pianist of mine, although I didn't study with him. I went off to Juilliard to study with Adele Marcus, who was also another very well-known teacher. They had different teaching styles, but he was really well-known for his Beethoven playing. In fact, when I studied in Vienna, my teacher there came in second in Queen Elizabeth when Fleischer won. So it's like passing greetings back and forth, and we sort of 7 degrees of separation. I never really met him and worked with him till I did a few years ago. And he asked me to play for him before we rehearsed with the orchestra, which was rather intimidating. And as I mentioned to Kelly before, I made sure I was really prepared for that experience. So that was kind of preparatory work for playing this concert on somewhat short notice. So I feel it's in my bones, ready to play.
So is it the case with for piano for soloists like yourself to have this some method of getting something back into your fingers? Is it something that happens naturally with some concertos? What is the process? Because we've been evolving our season so kind of week to week as it's opening up, able to program for a bigger orchestra, and then we were able to invite you to do this concert not that long ago. What is the process for you to bring something back to life for you, even if it's something you've played many times?
Well, I'm sure you've had this experience. I will listen to something I recorded 20 yeyears ago, and I say, is that me? Did I actually play that? I have no recollection. There are certain pieces that feel like I've done them, but I don't really recall that well. And there are certain pieces that I feel I could play, on 24 hours notice. And this particular piece is very close to me. It is possibly one of my favorites as well. That's one reason I was hoping to be able to play with you and the Symphoria this weekend to do this particular piece. I've taught it many times. I've played it many times. And this just happens to be an old friend.
That's great. So let's tell our audience a little bit about the piece, the typical 3-movement work. And I think it has one of the most unique and simple openings for the orchestra at the introduction. When you come in, it's just so spectacular, yet very simple. Tell us a little bit about, just like walk us through the piece, walk the audience through the piece, what sort of landmark things they might be able to expect.
Well, it is in a way an homage or a tribute to the Mozart C minor 491. It starts very similarly. Beethoven takes a nod to this particular thematic idea in the cadenza and in the low strings, and I think the 9th to the 10th measure. So in a way, it is kind of a tribute. Something similar to where Haydn in 1794 in his late English E-flat sonata wrote the same kind of motive that Beethoven used in his Fifth Symphony. So there's lots of kind of borrowing back and forth, and it's somewhat recognizable if you're aware of some of that music. This particular piece, which was sort of started around 1800 and not really played till 1803, is at the beginning of his heroic period. And so you're kind of moving into the really mature playing. It's very majestic, it's very solid, it's very strong. If I can use the word, Beethoven is no longer polite. This is very solid music. The first movement is structurally very clear. The key of C minor is a key of fate and of heroism. The audience will hear long melodies, things that they can kind of hear and sing as they leave the hall. So you know that was one sign of being popular. Very fiery, tempestuous cadenza written by Beethoven in the end of the first movement. The second movement is very interesting because he marks very long pedals that are meant to blur over various harmonies in the key of E major, which is totally unrelated to the key of C minor. So it's somewhat startling and people somewhat taken back, but the beauty is just so magnificently transcendent, the music, and beautiful duets between the flutes, bassoons, and piano in the second movement. Lovely string writing. And as you said, the last movement is very playful. It's almost a gypsy kind of thing with some syncopation. Lovely contrasting middle section and a really rollicking coda. So it's very easy listening. And I think people will really enjoy the piece.
That's excellent. I have a lot of memories of conducting this piece for the orchestra. It's so much fun because there's so much interplay with the soloist. The last movement, it's very tricky because we just have to catch you on those scales, and it's those intersections are so exciting and so present for the audience, the orchestra to be on their toes. Really looking forward to this. So just as a final note, can you tell us a little bit about how it's been for you during, this past year? I know a lot of people are envious of pianists because you can perform complete recitals by yourself a little more easily than some other pianists, certainly easier than conductors.
Sure.
And can you tell us a little bit about the last year for you?
Well, a lot of the past 2020, a lot of things were shut down. We weren't doing Zoom concerts or live streams. So I kind of took that time, kind of worked through my bucket list of pieces that I always wanted to learn. And I learned about 2 or 3 full programs. It was really a nice period away from playing in public. Since the beginning of this year, I've done 3 Zoom concerts. So we're kind of getting back into the swing of things. I missed playing for people. You're talking about pianists can do a Zoom concert, but when I played in an empty hall on a Zoom concert, it's a really different feeling.
Yeah.
You make a mistake and you're like, oh, let's do that again like you're practicing. No, this is a concert. And that's one thing I'm so looking forward to this week, with playing with everybody, seeing all my friends and making music as a large group again. And it's just going to really be a thrill for me.
Well, I can totally relate to that. I've had a chance, surprisingly, a couple times in this past year to work with an orchestra in front of people in the audience. It's been rare. It hasn't been in this state. But surprisingly, with Symphoria's streaming concerts that we've been doing, we're very aware of the audience still being there. We're aware of people taking in the music. And so when we play, even though we don't hear the audience in the hall, there really is a feeling of connection through the internet, through streaming, because we know that it's going to be received in the way that we're presenting it at that moment. And so, we obviously look forward to welcoming people back to the hall. But these concerts, and I think you'll find this when we perform this week, the audience feels present, and really look forward to you taking that in and giving them, this amazing concerto.
It is a great piece, and it's, like I said, it's a real thrill for me and a real treat for me to work with you and to play with Symphoria again this week. And even though I know there's no audience there, I certainly know it's a concert. Absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much. And
looking forward to it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And now I'd like to welcome our next guest, Peter Rabinowitz, who will talk to us about the Mozart Symphony. Peter, good to see you.
Hi, Larry. Been a while. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm excited for this concert because we get to have the whole orchestra on the stage. It's been a while since we've done that. Although we started this past weekend with our Pops concert with wonderful Sean O'Loughlin. It's so great to have the whole orchestra on the stage, and it's a really great program.
It is, and I share your enthusiasm. You know, we've gotten to play a lot of really unusual music during the pandemic, and that's been great too. But there still is this sense, well, it's great, but it's not an orchestra. So this is really wonderful.
Right. Yeah. So let's talk about the Mozart. The famous 40th Symphony is it's one of the most often requested works. It's been on our radar to program during our regular season, and we recently did his final symphony, the Jupiter 41. But number 40 has been on the radar, and we get a lot of requests for it. Some people don't know it by the key or the number. They just sing the opening line and say, that one.
Sing for us?
Right. And it's it's such an open, incredibly unique opening to a symphony. Do you want to talk a little bit about Mozart in general? Obviously this is mature Mozart for him, his life, and his evolution of his symphonies, and where he is at the 40th.
Actually, I mean, just go back a step. Try to imagine what would have happened if Mozart had lasted until 1830 or 1840. I mean, it's unbelievable.
I often think about that. Yeah.
Yeah. But we have so much Mozart, and it's so good. Actually, what I was saying, talking about the history of this, I have, when I write my program notes, one of the things I'm really interested in is how a piece was considered in the past and how our views of it have changed. And being a program note writer, I like to read old program notes, particularly really old program notes. And the New York Philharmonic is one of those orchestras that has a fantastic digital collection, which includes program notes from every concert pretty well that they can find, all the way back to the founding of the orchestra. So you can go back and find when it was they first performed the Mozart, and if they had program notes, and program notes go back to the 1890s, and they were really weird, some of them in the old days. And one of the things that's really been interesting is that Mozart at first was considered this very delicate composer and very light. And the 40th Symphony always gave people a little trouble because it wasn't quite delicate and light. Now it's considered as something a little bit different. So do you have some sense of the history of this piece, or the history of your sense of this piece?
Well, I mean, my personal history is that I always remember the symphony because it was one that was often played. It was on the radio a lot. It was, I'm sure I've gone to concerts where I heard it because it was so popular growing up. As a clarinetist, my relationship with Mozart is very strongly tied to the quintet and the concerto. And so I always think of him as a clarinet-friendly composer, even though he wrote very little for the clarinet.
Right.
But what he wrote is sort of the staple of our repertoire. And this symphony has a version with or without clarinets. So I immediately always gravitate towards the version with the clarinets, which it does take some solos away from some of the other instruments because he splits them all up differently. But this later version of the symphony with clarinets is, much more colorful. And I love that sound in his late music. And the first time I conducted it was actually for this. I'm trying to remember what company hired us to do this, but it was a company. It was one of those conferences, and the Colorado Symphony, which was my first job. We were hired to be behind a scrim, and I was supposed to tap on the music stand to get the musicians' attention, and then conduct a little bit of it, and then say that it was all wrong, and then to change some things, and then play it again. Just the opening. This music was picked because it was one of the most recognizable classical symphonies that anyone in the audience would have heard. And it was supposed to be a metaphor. I mean, so this is just my first association with this music, was this kind of contrived convention for tech company. And so, I've gone a long way since then, done a lot of performances. But it's funny. So in my head, I think it started off as this sort of quintessential stereotype of symphony played by a live orchestra. And now it's just one of the most compelling works. And having conducted many of the Mozart symphonies, it just has such a special meaning for me the whole way through. Every movement has something spectacular and interesting about it. And so I don't think of it as light music. Even if I approach it with a light hand, I think the music has a lot of, a lot of depth.
Well, we talk about the light hand. One of the things that's happened in my lifetime, which is a little longer than yours, that I remember the Mozart 40th being performed by people like Karajan in particular, who would give it this very big, thick, Germanic heaviness. And then we had the rise of the historically informed performances where vibrato was minimized, orchestra was reduced in size, clarity was increased. And now people are sort of trying to come up with their own way of dealing with that long tradition. And I know for you, clarity is almost always like the first virtue. So I assume you're playing this, you're emphasizing clarity, but how do you fit yourself into all these different interpretive traditions, or what's your way of hitting this symphony?
Yeah, that's a great question, because early in my career, it wasn't like a Karajan kind of like heavy Germanic, big, thick sound, very, very sustained, overly romantic. I wasn't quite there, but I was definitely more in that direction. And then I was assistant in Dallas, and Carlos Colomar came down to conduct, I think it was just like Don Giovanni Overture or something like that. And he did it where like zero vibrato, every note was released in that once the attack happens, it immediately decays. There's this quick diminution of volume, and the transparency was incredible. Even if I didn't love, like that for myself, it was a really interesting approach. And that was sort of during the rise of what you were saying, this sort of performance practice, to try to replicate maybe the way that musicians played it during Mozart's time. But for me, I try to strike a balance between some of those gestures, specifically releasing of a sustained note in a natural way, to leave room for other motives and other lines to come to the surface, because so much of what he writes is not everyone playing the same thing, but this polyphony where you have so many different melodies working against each other, and that he does even more so in his later music. That's something that really rises to the surface better if you do some of those things. So I try to strike a balance between playing something with minimal vibrato, but also to have some substance in the sound, and some transparency. That kind of a long, convoluted answer to that, but
no, but it's really interesting, and we could go on with that for a long time because it's really important, I think, in how the music sounds to us today. But you also said something about how all these movements have this special meaning for you, and maybe we could spend a minute or two just talking about like what you think of your favorite parts of the symphony, or why they strike you as they do.
Sure. Well, obviously we talked a little bit about the opening of the first movement. Yeah. There's just this. There's so many ways to approach this opening. It's conversational. And then another. And so it's question answer kind of gesture with that melody and the violins. Just because we're short on time, second and third movements are so contrasting, with major key and then a minuet in minor that has overlapping themes. The last movement, though, is just a kind of opposites. You have quiet and loud, and then this amazing 12-tone moment at the beginning of the second half of this piece, which we will take the repeat so you hear it twice, where he literally writes all 12 tones way before his time in terms of 12-tone music, as part of that melody. He just contorts it into a way that hits every note in 4 bars, and it's just one of the most amazing moments in history.
Yeah, it is a fabulous moment, and I think we've run out of time, so I think that's a good place to end. But I hope everybody looks forward to that, and we're really looking forward to this performance. It's really going to be an exciting evening for all of us.
Absolutely. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Larry.